Lying in bed, I often find myself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, lost in thoughts about how everything has changed. Life should be good. I have a stable job, a cozy home, and a husband who, at least in theory, loves me. But something inside of me pulls in a different direction, a heavy, aching feeling I can't quite shake off. I should be content. I have everything that others might envy, but I feel disconnected. Richard and I have been married for several years now. On the outside, everything looks fine. The kind of fine that people might look at and think, they have it together. But I know that something's not right. We've drifted so far apart and I can't tell when it happened. There are no fights, no obvious arguments, just this quiet, creeping distance that has settled between us, like a fog I can't quite see through. I try to be rational. I tell myself that marriages go through phases, that things will get better if I just give it time, if I just stay patient. But the truth is, I don't know how much longer I can wait for something to change. It's not just the silence in the house when he's around, or the fact that he's almost always on his phone or working late. It's more than that. There's a coldness, a subtle shift in the way he looks at me, like he's not seeing me anymore. Not really. I'm not sure if it's just my own anxiety or if he feels it too, but when we talk, it feels like we're speaking different languages. At night, when I'm lying awake, I try to picture us like we were before. When we were happy, when I could feel his hand on my shoulder and know that everything was okay. But those moments seem so distant now. I close my eyes and try to sleep, but the emptiness in my chest keeps me wide awake, and the longer I lie there, the more certain I am that something is slipping through my fingers. The future that seemed so certain a few years ago feels fragile now. I don't know how much longer I can pretend. Richard's work has been consuming him more and more lately. I've gotten used to the routine. He leaves early, comes home late, and when he does make it back, it's like he's somewhere else. I can feel the weight of his absence, even when he's right next to me. He's physically present, but emotionally distant. The brief moments we share are shallow, polite, like two strangers politely acknowledging each other in passing. I've tried to ignore it, to tell myself that this is just a phase, that it will get better, but the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to lie to myself. One evening, after another solitary dinner, I sat down on the couch, flipping through an article about how women like me can lose themselves in a marriage, how we let our identities fade into the background of someone else's life. I hadn't even realized how much of myself had disappeared until I read those words. It was like someone had described my life in a way I couldn't even admit to myself. I had become a background character in my own story. Just as I was about to close my phone, a call came in. It was Richard. I smiled, half relieved, half skeptical. I hadn't heard his voice in what felt like forever. I expected some warmth, a reassurance that he was thinking of me, but what I heard was nothing like that. His voice was distant, like he was speaking through a fog, or maybe like he was miles away. His words were brief, almost clipped. He didn't ask how I was or if I needed anything. It was just a functional check-in, the kind of call you make when you're too busy to be present. "I'll be home late," he said. And then there was a pause before he added, "I'll call you later." It wasn't the words themselves that struck me, but the way they hung in the air, cold and hollow. I felt like I was talking to someone who didn't really care to talk to me. When the call ended, I sat there staring at my phone. My chest felt tight, as though the space between us had grown exponentially in those few minutes. I wanted to call him back, ask him why he sounded so distant, but I didn't. I didn't know what I would say, or if it would even matter. I hung up the phone, feeling like a stranger in my own life. When Richard suggested his nephew Mike stay with us, I didn't think much of it. Mike was almost an adult, polite, and it would only be for a short time. I agreed, not expecting anything to change. But Mike's presence started to make me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. He didn't do anything obvious, no flirtations or comments, but there was something in the way he watched me, his eyes lingering a moment too long. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel like I was being observed, like he was always paying attention to me. One evening, while I was cooking, I caught him staring at me again. When our eyes met, I felt a strange tension, as if he saw something in me I didn't want him to see. "Need help?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something in it that made me uneasy. I quickly turned back to my task, forcing a smile. Mike's presence had started to feel like a quiet intrusion, nothing overt, just a growing unease I couldn't shake off, and as much as I tried to convince myself it meant nothing, deep down, I knew something had changed. As the days passed, I found it harder to ignore the way Mike seemed to be blending into our life. It was as if he was becoming a fixture, like a part of the furniture that you stop noticing, until it starts to feel out of place. He was always around, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the living room, sitting quietly, observing. I could feel his gaze on me more often than I was comfortable with, and it made me feel like I was constantly being watched, even when I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just a young guy. Maybe I was overthinking it. But every time I caught his eyes, there was this unsettling feeling in my chest, like I was being studied, analyzed. His attention wasn't overtly inappropriate, but it made me feel strangely exposed. One night Richard was away, and it was just Mike and me at home. We were both doing our own things. He was on his phone, and I was scrolling through a book. But there was an undeniable tension in the air. We didn't say much, but the silence between us felt heavy. Mike suddenly spoke. "Do you ever think about what's next?" His voice was quiet, like he wasn't expecting me to answer, but the question lingered, hanging between us. I wasn't sure how to respond. The question felt loaded, more personal than casual. I avoided his eyes and mumbled something about how I didn't know what he meant, but I could feel my heart racing. Something about that moment made me aware of the line that had been crossed, even if it wasn't visible yet. Something had shifted, and I couldn't tell if it was in him or in me or both of us. It wasn't just Mike anymore. It was the space between us, the invisible line that had grown thinner and thinner each day. I didn't know how much longer I could ignore it. That night, after Mike's question, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening that I couldn't control. The unease that had been building for days now felt like an actual weight on my chest, something that pressed down on me with every breath. The days started to blur together, and I realized with a start that I was thinking about Mike more than I should. I tried to push it away, but his presence seemed to be everywhere. His gaze, his subtle movements. It was like he was always close, always watching. And despite my attempts to ignore it, my mind kept returning to that question he had asked me. "Do you ever think about what's next?" What was next? My marriage had become a routine, a quiet, monotonous pattern that I didn't know how to break. Richard had grown even more distant, wrapped up in his career, and I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. The connection we once shared seemed like a distant memory, slipping further and further away. One evening, when Richard was out of town again, Mike and I ended up sitting together in the living room. I could feel the air between us shift, thicker now, more charged. Mike was sitting a little closer than usual, but it wasn't the physical proximity that disturbed me. It was the way he looked at me, like he was searching for something I didn't want to be found. The silence stretched between us, heavy and tense. Finally, he spoke again. "You know, things don't have to stay like this, you know. There's always a way out." I didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't just talking about his staying with us or our daily lives. There was something more behind his words, something that felt dangerously personal. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to brush it off, tell myself he was just being a naive young man, but it wasn't that simple. His gaze was too intense, and the way he spoke felt too intimate. And then, in that moment, I realized something. I was no longer in control. I had allowed something to creep in, something I couldn't ignore any longer. My marriage was already broken, but now, with Mike's presence, something else was unraveling too. Something that would be harder to put back together. Days passed, but the tension between Mike and me only seemed to grow. It was no longer something I could ignore, no matter how hard I tried. The moments we spent together, quiet and lingering, had become more than just uncomfortable. They felt charged, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't undo. Richard was away again, and I had convinced myself that I should just keep my distance from Mike, that maybe if I could maintain some space between us, it would all go back to normal. But when he came into the room that evening, I could see something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. He was standing near the door, watching me. It wasn't just his usual quiet gaze. This time, there was something else there, something almost unsettling in the way he looked at me. I felt a knot form in my stomach, the weight of something unspoken hanging between us. "You don't have to pretend," Mike said softly, breaking the silence. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what he meant, but I could feel that he knew something. He could feel the shift, too. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words I wanted to say, the excuse I wanted to make, all seemed inadequate. He took a step closer and I instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The space between us felt small, suffocating. He smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "It's okay, you know. I'm not judging you," he said, his voice low, but filled with something that made the air crackle. "I understand." I felt my breath catch. I couldn't figure out if he was trying to comfort me or if he was waiting for me to admit something, to acknowledge something I hadn't allowed myself to face. The silence stretched again, and I realized that the moment we were in was impossible to ignore any longer. This wasn't just about Mike or me anymore. It was about everything that had been wrong between Richard and me for so long, and the sudden, terrifying realization that maybe I wasn't as innocent in this as I wanted to believe. I knew at that moment that everything was changing, that whatever was happening now, whatever this was going to change the course of my life forever, and it wasn't something I could undo. The days after that night with Mike felt like they were stretched thin, each hour moving with a strange, unbearable slowness. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had broken, that the delicate balance I had once believed we still had in our home was gone. The line between what was right and wrong, what was acceptable and what wasn't, had blurred in a way that left me confused and terrified. Mike had crossed a boundary that night, or maybe I had. I couldn't tell anymore. The tension between us had grown palpable, like an invisible thread pulling tighter with every interaction. But the more I tried to distance myself from him, the more impossible it became. I knew it was wrong, whatever it was that was happening, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about him. The phone call with Richard came the next afternoon. He sounded distracted, his voice flat. "I'll be home soon," he said, "but don't wait up. I've got more work to do." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I didn't even know what to say to him anymore. There was a part of me that wanted to scream, to beg him to see me, to see that I was drowning in a marriage that felt more like a quiet prison every day. But instead, I held my tongue, the silence between us growing thicker. That evening, when Richard returned, there was something in his eyes, something that told me he knew. I couldn't explain it, not in words, but it was there, in the way he watched me, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. He didn't ask questions, but I could feel the weight of his silence, heavy and suffocating. It was then that I realized he had noticed. He might not have said anything, but he knew. There was a crack in the surface, and though we both pretended like it wasn't there, it was undeniable. I was trapped in a web of my own making, between the silence with Richard and the dangerous pull of what was happening with Mike. I couldn't escape it. Every word I didn't say, every look I didn't acknowledge, had built this wall of tension around us. The truth was out there, floating between us, but none of us were brave enough to voice it. I could feel Richard's eyes on me throughout the evening, like he was waiting for me to break. But I couldn't. I couldn't even admit it to myself. I didn't want to face it. What would I say? That everything had changed? That I was lost? That I didn't know how to fix it? I couldn't fix it. I couldn't fix anything anymore. And as I lay in bed that night, the silence between us suffocating, I knew that something had shattered, and that there was no way to put the pieces back together. The next morning, when we were all gathered in the living room, the tension was suffocating. Richard had returned home late, and Mike, as usual, was quietly present in the background, his presence a constant reminder of the changes I could no longer ignore. The house felt like it was holding its breath, as if waiting for something to break. And it did. Richard entered the room, his expression unreadable. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at me, and then at Mike, his gaze sharp, cold. I could feel the weight of it, the silent judgment that hung between us. It was like he knew everything, like he had finally pieced it all together without a single word being said. And then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the fury beneath it. "I don't know what's been going on here, but I can feel it. I can see it." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I couldn't defend myself. What could I say? How could I explain? I wanted to tell him that nothing had happened, that I hadn't meant for any of it to go this far, but I knew it wouldn't matter. It was too late for explanations. Richard didn't wait for me to say anything. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something in them. Something that wasn't just frustration, but betrayal. "You've destroyed everything, haven't you?" he said, his voice breaking for just a moment, before he regained his composure. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the weight of his disappointment, the finality in his tone. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. He had seen through the facade, seen through the cracks that had been growing for so long. The truth was out, and there was no way to undo it. Mike stood up, looking at me with a mixture of regret and uncertainty. "I didn't want this to happen," he said softly, his voice almost apologetic. But it didn't matter. His words were hollow now, like a confession that came too late. Richard turned to leave, his shoulders stiff with the weight of his decision. He didn't look back, didn't say another word. It was like he had already made up his mind, and there was nothing left for us to discuss. As the door slammed behind him, I felt a hollow emptiness spread through the house. I was alone. The life I had known, the life I had tried to protect, was gone. And the worst part was that I couldn't even blame him. I had let it all slip away. Mike stood there, his presence in the room now an uncomfortable reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But he didn't speak. We didn't speak. We just stood in silence, the weight of our actions hanging heavy between us. There was nothing left to say. The life I had built, the marriage I had fought to preserve, was over. And all that was left was the quiet aftermath, a new reality I had never wanted, but one that I had somehow brought upon myself. I closed my eyes and let the silence engulf me. There was no turning back now. The damage had been done, and I was left to face the consequences, alone. In the days that followed Richard's departure, everything felt hollow. The house, which had once felt like a home, now seemed cold and alien. The silence that filled the spaces between us was deafening. I tried to move through the motions of daily life, making meals, cleaning up, going to work, but everything felt unreal, like I was floating in a fog, unable to touch anything solid. Mike had moved out shortly after Richard left. I barely saw him in the days that followed, and when I did, he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and avoidance. It was like we were both trying to erase what had happened, but it was impossible. The events were carved into our lives, permanent and undeniable. I found myself constantly thinking about Richard. The weight of his absence was crushing, but it was also the absence of something else. The loss of something I hadn't even realized I'd taken for granted. His absence felt like the death of a dream, a life that could never return. I kept going through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, but deep down, I was unraveling. The guilt, the shame. They gnawed at me, reminding me of the mistakes I couldn't undo. I had destroyed everything. I had destroyed us. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness, though that was unbearable at times. It was the fact that I knew I couldn't go back. The weight of the choices I had made, the actions I had taken, were irreversible. I had shattered a life that had once seemed so stable, so certain. And now I was left with the shards, pieces too broken to fit back together. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat down on the couch, the stillness of the room pressing in around me. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. I hesitated before opening it, not sure if I was ready to face whatever it was he had to say.